Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. In 1983, I-10 released their first album, Taking a Cold Look. The group was fronted by Billy Steinberg and Tom Kelly, who had already made their name in the industry as a songwriting duo, writing hits for other artists, and this was their first chance to step into the spotlight and record the music themselves. Unfortunately, it would also be their last. Despite strong reviews and a powerhouse lineup with some of the best session musicians of the era, the album failed to perform and I-10 disbanded shortly after. Steinberg and Kelly went back to working as songwriters, ultimately writing 5 #1 singles for other artists. A couple years later, when the call came in that Huart, who by the way is one of the most underrated rock bands of the 70s, don't at me, but anyway, when the call came in that they were looking for a power ballad, Kelly suggested giving them one from the I-10 album to see if the Wilson sisters could make anything of it. Turns out they could. As you've probably worked out by now, that ballad was Alone, and it gave the band their second #1 single. Let's take it apart. The song starts like this. And because it's a cover that far eclipsed the original version, I think it might be useful to compare the two. I've argued before that the best way to do a cover is to change as much as possible, but the Huart version is actually a pretty faithful reproduction, sticking mostly to the composition choices Steinberg and Kelly made. And honestly, that's fine. That rule is mostly for when your audience already knows the original. If they do, you're going to be competing with it, so you need to stand out, but if it's a great song that never got the attention it deserved, all you really need is a couple adjustments in order to help it live up to its full potential. And while there aren't many changes, the ones they did make are pretty significant. Each one feels like a noticeable improvement, and that starts right here in the intro. I-10's version is played at around 80 beats per minute, while Huart's is around 90. That faster tempo gives it an increased sense of urgency. I-10 wants to get you alone, but Huart needs to. Now, some of you might be saying, hold on, that's just because you're comparing them. If you play a slower thing and then a faster thing, the faster thing is gonna sound fast. That doesn't mean it is. The difference between 80 and 90 BPM is pretty small. In old-timey music terms, they're both andante. And yeah, that's fair, but I do still think this is significant. After all, prior to working on this video, I'd never heard the I-10 version, but the Huart one still always felt a little rushed to me, and I think that's because of this intro. The spiky tone of the piano and the way Tom Salisbury is playing it just scream 80s power ballad. It's giving me strong Total Eclipse of the Heart vibes, and that song is 65 BPM. Most power ballads I can think of are in that 60 to 80 range, so while 90 isn't so fast it falls out of the genre, it's fast enough to feel like it's pushing the edge just a little bit. Both songs start off with the same stylistic markers, and those markers imply a tempo that's a little closer to I-10's than it is to Huart's. They're both playing the same chord progression though, so let's look at that. I'm gonna treat this like a 4-chord loop. I mean, it's not, the pattern is 8 chords long, but the first 3 repeat. The only difference is the last chord, so I think the best approach here is gonna be viewing it as 2 alternating versions of the same loop structure. But what is that structure? Well, it's complicated. When I'm breaking down 4-chord loops, I like to start by looking for the destinations, that is, chords that are approached by strong harmonic motion and then leave by weak harmonic motion. These typically create a clear sense of arrival, and the positions of the destinations, along with the methods used to approach them, go a long way toward explaining the sound of the loop. But there's 2 different ways to define harmonic motion. Are we talking about root motion or bass motion? Honestly, it usually doesn't matter. In most of the styles that regularly use chord loops, these are the same thing, but one notable exception is the power ballad. Power ballads, especially piano-based ones like Alone, will often use inversions or chord voicings where the lowest note isn't the root of the chord, and that makes it a lot harder to track the motion of the loop. So let's split it up and see what each approach is telling us. Let's start with root motion. For the first 3 chords, this is pretty simple. B flat minor to G flat is weak. They're a third apart and they use most of the same notes, so the move to G flat feels much more like a departure than an arrival. G flat to A flat though is moving by step, which is typically strong. So far, so good. From here, the 2 versions of the loop split, but not by much. A flat to A flat 7 is extremely weak. We're basically sitting still. A flat to F7 is also weak, just like before, these two are a third apart. F7 uses an A natural, which clashes with the A flat in the previous chord, but while this adds some extra spiciness to the transition, it's not a very directional sound, so I still prefer to think of it as weak motion. And finally, A flat 7 and F7 both provide strong resolutions back to B flat minor. This means that in both cases we have a pattern of weak, strong, establishing two roughly equivalent destinations, the B flat minor and the A flat. The use of F7, along with the emphasis on B flat in the melody and the fact that it's the first chord in the loop, imply that B flat is the actual root here, but in terms of chord motion, we're basically just seesawing back and forth between two strong positions. But is that what the bass is doing too? Come on, of course not. That'd make my job easier, and songs hate making my job easy. The first three chords are in root position, so we still get that same start of weak to strong, but when we get to the last chord, our paths diverge. We said the root motion from the A flat chord was always weak, but A flat to G flat and A flat to A natural are both stepwise motion, and stepwise motion sounds strong. In both cases, the A flat is abandoning its role as a destination by setting up the next bass note with a strong directional approach. Where things get really interesting though is when we go back to the start. G flat to B flat is a major third, and as we saw earlier, major thirds are weak, but A to B flat? That's a spicy meatball. Why did I write that? Anyway, this means that if we care about bass motion, the structures of the two loops aren't the same. In the first, the destination is buried on the incoming chord, which is extremely unusual because it just kills the momentum, and in the second, we have this cascade of strong stepwise motion marching us from the G flat departure all the way back to B flat. So can we synthesize these two analyses into one explanation of the entire loop? I don't know, but we can certainly try. They both agree on the first three chords, so let's skip those. All we care about is the motion into and out of the final chord. With the A flat 7, it's almost like we're inverting the polarity. The entrance is weak strong and the exit is strong weak, so the whole thing just sounds kinda confusing. It does its job, but it feels like a dead end. For the F7, we have a similar contradictory entrance, but the exit is all strong. Instead of sounding uncertain, the momentary disagreement serves to emphasize the final resolution. If they played an F in the bass, it'd still work, but we'd lose the connecting thread that makes the B flat chord feel so thoroughly complete. Taken together, this gives us two versions of a loop that for the most part follow the same pattern of harmonic motion throughout, but with subtle nuances that guide our ears through a more complex pattern of tension and release within it. It's a really nice progression. From there, we're joined by Ann Wilson.
I hear the ticking of the clock. I'm lying here, the room's pitch dark.
Singing a fairly straightforward B-flat minor melody, but I don't care about the notes. I want to talk about that phrasing. Each line consists of two phrases, and each phrase is 5 beats long. But the song is in 4/4, and this rhythmic misalignment pushes the second one into an awkward position across the bar line, rebounding off the downbeat and trying to resolve to beat 2. It feels incomplete, like there's something important that she's leaving unsaid. The implications of that are left hanging as the vocals pause for almost 2 full bars before beginning the next line, giving you a lot of time to marinate in the subtext. And even when she is singing, there's a hesitancy to it, like she's not sure she's supposed to be talking about this, and that comes in part from the rhythm. Each phrase starts in an offbeat, sitting between the cracks of the meter, giving it this aura of subtlety and gentleness. Taken together, all these phrasing elements combine to give the impression that this is a difficult secret to share, an intimate moment of longing that we're almost intruding on by listening. That leads into the pre-chorus. And while all these chords do belong in B-flat minor, I don't think that's what's happening. This sounds way more like a relative modulation where we change to a new key that has all the same notes, it just uses them differently. Specifically, I think we're in D-flat major now. Why? Well, for starters, there's that high synth that's just holding D-flat the entire time. The melody's also mostly on D-flat.
And the night goes by so very slow.
And of course, there's 2 D-flat chords and no B-flat chords. Sometimes these relative modulations can be ambiguous and difficult to spot, but sometimes they're not. This one's not. They really want to make sure we don't miss the move to the relative major. But just because there's obvious clues doesn't mean there's not subtle ones as well, so if you'll permit me to waste a little bit more of your time demonstrating a point that I think I've already pretty thoroughly established, I'd like to talk about the second chord. If we were in B flat and we were gonna do this sort of walk down, we'd almost certainly want to use either an F major or an F7. That's the 5 chord, and as I mentioned earlier, it's a strong directional sound that clearly points back to 1. Instead though, they use D flat with an F in the bass, which makes a lot more sense if we're in D flat. In terms of chord function, the 3 chord is a little unwieldy. It doesn't really behave in a way that's conducive to this kind of harmony, so in situations where you really want the 3rd in the bass, it's pretty normal to play the 1 chord on top of it instead. It just sounds more complete and it doesn't get in the way. In D flat then, this D flat over F allows us to get the bass walk down without having to deal with the implications of an F chord, whereas in B flat we'd be voluntarily introducing the 3 chord in order to avoid playing a much cleaner harmonic option. That's a weird decision, so it seems more natural to hear this in the key where this move makes sense. The first time through, the progression walks straight down from 4 to 1, settling gently into our new root, but the second time, in order to really cement the change, they add in a quick detour to our new key's 5 chord, and then we start to prepare ourselves for the chorus. This is where we see one of the biggest, most significant changes between the two versions. In both cases, the pre-chorus ends with a soft, almost solo piano, and then the chorus has the full band playing at a much higher dynamic, but the way Huart does it sounds so much better. Despite the fact that their piano never gets as quiet as I-10's, the arrival of their chorus hits way harder, and that's down to 2 main changes. The first one takes place right before the transition. They're trying to move from a soft ballady piano to a more hard rock chorus, so I-10 does what most rock bands of the time would do and set it up with a big sexy drum fill. And yeah, that works. It's cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. It gets the job done. Huart, on the other hand, decides to set up their chorus with, nothing. There's no warning, no preparation. If you've never heard the song before, you have no way of knowing what's about to happen. The new dynamic just appears out of nowhere. The other change comes right after the transition. Here's how I-10 starts the chorus. And here's how Huart does it. And to be fair, this change was actually I-10's idea, as Billy Steinberg explains in an interview with Song Facts.
We heard that Huart was looking for a power ballad, and Tom said, "What about Alone?" I winced and said, "Oh, I don't really want to look at that song." He said, "What do you mean? That's perfect." And I said, "Well, let me think. Specifically, I don't like the first line of the chorus." And he said, "Well, let's rewrite it." So we took the song out, and sure enough, it was relatively easy to do because we liked everything about the song except the first line of the chorus.
And in addition to being an extremely funny anecdote that perfectly captures the arbitrary whims of the creative process, I think he's absolutely right. Listening to both versions side by side, it's hard to deny that the new one is both lyrically and melodically more interesting. The jagged phrasing, the more complex contour with the step up to the octave, it all just works better, but the most important part is that it starts a lot sooner. In the I-10 version, he doesn't start singing until after beat 3, giving the chorus dynamic time to establish itself without him. But Wilson's line starts on beat 2, much closer to the actual transition, so that her powerful belting voice becomes a part of that dynamic rather than sitting on top of it. Taken together, I-10's chorus transition exists in 4 dynamic layers. We start with piano, then drums, then the full band, then the voice. Huart reduces that to just 2, going from 0 to 60 in a single beat. The whole thing hits like a freight train because there are no steps, no gradual build-up to make the final form of the chorus feel like a natural continuation of what came before it. We're simply thrown into the deep end and have to remember how to swim. This eruption of sonic energy creates a sense of desperation, a sudden outpouring of emotion that she can no longer hold herself back from expressing. All those unspoken thoughts from the verse are finally coming out in a tidal wave of desire. And this chorus has another surprise in store for us. I said in the pre-chorus that we'd move to the relative major, which uses all the same notes as our starting key. Like, here's the first line of the verse melody.
I hear the ticking of the clock.
With a beautiful sounding C natural at the end, so if we look at the chorus melody, we'd expect to see...
Till now,
Oh no. Right off the bat, in the second note of the section, we've got a C flat. Or a B, I guess, but let's not open that can of worms. And it's not a one-off either. The second chord in the section is C flat major. And throughout the chorus, all the C's in the melody are flat.
I never really cared until I met you.
That means we're not actually in D-flat major at all. We're in a slightly different scale called D-flat mixolydian. We overshot the relative modulation and wound up picking up an extra flat. This is a really interesting move to me. Remember, we're coming from B-flat minor, so we've effectively shifted to a brighter tonality in a darker key. We're major now, sort of, but with this shadow hanging over our heads. But why the change from the pre-chorus? Why establish us in major and then switch to mixolydian? Well, I mean, did they? Looking back at the pre-chorus, they didn't really play many Cs at all. It's basically just this one beat of A flat 7. So they could do a quick 5-1 resolution, which is a pretty common move even in scales that don't typically use a major 7th. This is another reason the D flat over F works so well. Playing an F chord there would have forced them to commit to some kind of C, and they didn't want to give it away yet. You could easily argue that they never really told us we were in major, they just didn't tell us we weren't and let us assume the rest from context. The mixolydian chorus doesn't actually contradict the tonality they've established, but the prominent C flat right as it begins is still a shock, especially supported by the dynamic changes. It's a gut punch, taking the hopeful arc of the pre-chorus and twisting it into something painful. As for the chords, it's our old friend the axis progression, and if you're not familiar with the axis progression, then yes, you are, you just don't know the name. This is one of the most common chord loops in the history of chord loops. It usually comes in one of two forms. We can either play it like this, which makes it sound like G flat major is the root, or we can rotate it around to start in the middle, which puts us more in E flat minor. That second one is what they do in this song, but with a twist. Typically, these two chords are most likely to sound like the one due to the shape of the loop and the relationships between the chords. But here, the band kind of buries them, cutting them off early by anticipating the other two chords. This rhythmic de-emphasis makes it harder to hear them as the one, which leaves us looking for another strong place to land, and the surrounding musical context does the rest, pointing our ear back toward D-flat. In most cases, this loop isn't all that stable on the mixolydian root, but by metrically disrupting all the stronger options, they manage to make it work. The chorus ends like this. Dropping the loop in order to do a big, clear walk up to D-flat, over which Wilson sings the main hook, which is significant because it's the only phrase in the entire song that she starts singing directly on the downbeat. In the verses, everything was delayed, while the pre-chorus used pickups. The chorus did a little of both, but here, finally, on the most important line where she finally expresses her deepest desire, she's right there on beat 1. No hesitation, no wavering. It's really powerful, and it only works because of all the different phrasing choices throughout the rest of the song. From there, we go through the whole cycle again, but this time the chorus transition is a little different. The second time through, they do add the drum fill, because you've already heard the raw transition. They can't surprise you this time, so they might as well go for that big 80s cliche fill. Again, it's a cliche for a reason. You're still expecting the vocals to come in right away, but instead they sit on an instrumental loop for a little bit until Wilson comes roaring in with this. I don't really have anything to say about this part, at least nothing that's not stunningly obvious just from listening to it, but I thought you might enjoy hearing the isolated vocals anyway. In fact, here it is again. You're welcome. After that, there's a guitar solo that starts over the chorus progression before switching to a big long walk down the scale, then they loop the tag from the end of the chorus for a bit before ending on a return to the soft piano from the intro. It's a short song with not a lot of sections, but before we go, there's one final change they made, and it's one I've been waiting until the very end of the video to talk about so that hopefully the sorts of people who will be mad at me for bringing it up will have already stopped watching, and all that's left are cool people like you. You are cool, right? Don't let me down. Okay, so the thing is, the I-10 version is sung by Billy Steinberg, or Tom Kelly. I'm not entirely sure, but either way, it's sung by a man. The Huart version is sung by Ann Wilson, who is a woman. Now, I don't want to get too deep into gender politics here, because there's plenty of people who can do that way better than I can, but Alone is a song about romantic pursuit, and in the traditional courtship stories of mainstream American culture, that's a man's job. I'm not saying that's how it should work or even how it does work, but it's how we've historically told ourselves it's supposed to work. Men are hunters, women are... Ugh. The implications of this hunting metaphor are actually pretty gross, but it's a weirdly common way of describing dating, which kind of proves my point. And that's the cultural backdrop against which these two versions of the song were released. Telling the story in a man's voice like I-10 did is fine, but it's generic. We've all seen that movie before. I-10 simply describes the status quo, but Huart subverts it. Those same exact words in a woman's voice become transgressive as she takes an active role in her own sexuality in a world that doesn't often reward women for doing that. And this is a common theme in Huart songs. Probably the most obvious is Crazy on You. But many of their biggest hits are explicitly aggressively sexual, portraying their female protagonists not as trophies to be won or helpless maidens waiting to be noticed, but as people who want certain things and who aren't afraid to put themselves out there in order to get it. Huart was one of the first major hard rock bands fronted by a woman, and they managed to carve a place for themselves in such a traditionally masculine genre by refusing to back down from who they were and what they wanted to say. The Wilson sisters' songwriting was always bold and nuanced in ways many of their male counterparts never quite lived up to, and while they didn't actually write Alone, the decision to repurpose it like this was a brilliant one, taking a song that was already good and using their unique artistic voices to make it truly great. That's how I was planning to end this video. I don't even have drawings for this next part, but earlier this week, as I was wrapping up production, the news broke that the Supreme Court is probably about to overturn Roe v. Wade, and it felt inappropriate to end a discussion about how modern American society punishes female sexuality without mentioning that. It's a horrible situation, and it's gonna make the future a lot more dangerous for a lot of people, so if you have the means and you care about the health and well-being of pregnant folks, please consider donating to Planned Parenthood or, even better, a local abortion fund. They really need your help right now. I've put some resources in the description to help you find one. It feels weird to plug my social media stuff after that, but I do want to thank my featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sungard, Duck, Howard Levine, Warren Huart, Kevin Wilamowski, and Grant Aldonas. As always, like, share, comment, subscribe, and no matter what happens, keep on rockin'.